Here we go. So thanks very much, everyone, for attending. This is Out of the Page, Out of the Closet. It is one of the events that Lgbt Foundation is running for LGBT History Month in the UK. It is 28 days where we get to be proudly queer. Frankly, not enough days, but we'll take what we can get. Lgbt Foundation is a national charity that's registered in England. We work on promoting, uplifting, and advocating for LGBTQ rights. And we are always delighted to run community events such as this. We are all massive nerds and geeks at Foundation. It is surprising how much of a Venn diagram overlap there is with people who are LGBTQ+ and people who have nerdy interests. It's very exciting to be doing this. My name is Ethos Ahmed. My pronouns are he and him. I'm the head of policy and research at Lgbt Foundation. And I was very excited to be able to organize this event. I will be passing over to our other speakers to let them introduce themselves. And what I will ask for each speaker, if you could, your name, your pronouns, any affiliations and information you'd like to share, and a favorite LGBTQ+ comic or graphic novel moment. I will pass it to Chucky, and Chucky, once you're done, if you could pass it to someone else, and we'll go like that.
Sounds good. Hello, I'm Chucky. My real name is Jarrell, but no one calls me that. So Dr. Palmer Patel, my pronouns are she, her. I am currently unaffiliated, but am constantly looking. And I am co-editor of Fantastica Journal, which I started in 2016, which is a journal dedicated to imaginative narratives, fantasy, science fiction, gothic horror, and whatnot. I'm very excited that we're currently working on a call for papers for Queering Fantastica special issue. And Eloise Thomas is our special guest editor for that, to help ensure that we're sensitive and cover everything, because we're really just conscientious that we don't want to miss anything. So Fantastica Journal, call for papers if you're an academic, is March 1st, but because we've been too busy to advertise it, we're happy to offer an extension. And we also do reviews of fiction works that have come out in the last year. So if that's something that maybe you're not an academic, but you want to start dabbling in, give us a call or send us an email. And then my favorite comic book moment, I'm not going with my favorite, I'm going with the one that hooked me, which is Paper Girl Volume 6 and Volume 6, Volume 5. And up until the first 5 volumes, there wasn't any sort of LGBT narrative, and so it was really, I think that was why it hooked me, because it was just seemed really natural for these two characters to have a moment together. And then after that, I just started not seeking out LGBT comics, but coming across it and loving it. And then I started seeking it out, and I've been just obsessed since. So that's me. Eloise, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Jackie. And thank you, Ethos, for inviting me here. So I'm Heloise. My pronouns are she or they, indifferently, really. I just defended my own dissertation, so I'm also, I guess, Dr. Thomas, yay, just like my dad, which is really weird. But anyway, so I work on contemporary American, North American literature, so Canadian, US literature. I am affiliated with 2 universities in France right now, but also going to be looking for work really soon. Yay. So yeah, that's fun. I got a dissertation, I got a thesis, I got a PhD because I wanted to, delay the job market moment, but it's finally here. So yeah, I'm also, as Chucky said, the guest editor for the Queering Fantastica issue. I'm here to, make sure like things are, sensitive and everything, but I would like to say that I'm not, a representative of the entire LGBTQ community. I really just advocate for tired lesbians. That's like my niche representation. I would say that, okay, so my favorite, it can't be a favorite because I've got so many really, but I would say that like the moment I like the most in LGBTQ representation in comics in like the past 2 years is just picking up Cosmonauts by Hannah Templer, first as a webcomic and then as like the real book. And then because it's just so pretty and it's lesbians in space fighting patriarchy, and it's just like the colors are pretty and just it's space. So yeah, it's basically everything I wanted in a comic. So yeah, I was really excited to start reading it, and Templar has got the second volume going on her website, so that's also something to look forward to. In 2022, volume 2 is going to come out in paper form. So yeah, go read it. It's free on the internet if you haven't already. And now I'm handing the mic over to Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Jones, pronouns she, they. I'm currently affiliated with De Montfort University in Leicester, in the process of finishing up corrections to a thesis to submit in April to soon be a Dr. Jones. Finally, be free. And then I will be in the fun position of also being unaffiliated. But for now, currently have a sort of affiliation until it's done. Current favorite moment in comics is from this wonderful piece of work called Tea Dragon Tapestry. And if you guys haven't read the Tea Dragon Society books, they're so whimsy and like a warm cup of tea and a warm blanket, which is great. And there's this great moment where a character who's kind of like lost her memory and has been fostered by this community and kind of has this moment where she kind of meets her ancestor deity thing. And it tells her everything that happened is part of your wholeness, the sadness, the loss, the hurt, as well as the joy, the love, the friendship is all part of your tapestry. And it's just this moment where he's like, remember that you are already whole. And it's so beautiful. Just this idea that it presents of these characters all figuring out who they want to be and what they want to be. And I'm like, this is why I love this. So great. Instead of being all like, oh, you need to be fixed. It's like, no, you're already, you already have that, and just like loving yourself and all of that is just, love it. So great. Yeah. Welcome everybody. And also, yeah, thanks again for having me.
Well, thank you all very much for being here. I'm so delighted you all said yes. I'm really excited. I will in a moment also share what my favorite, because I realized I asked the question and never answered it, which is like a favorite tactic of everyone. What I will ask, if it's okay for the speakers, when you get the time to, if you could just drop the names of the comics and if possible the writers into, or the publishers or the artists into the chat for everyone, just in case anyone's missed it. It's just so people can keep track, but obviously no pressure. I'm terrible at multitasking, so I'm asking it now when you're not speaking. I know I won't be able to when I do it. My favorite, I have many favorite moments, but the one I'm going to pick is from the Marvel Comics Iceman solo series that was written by Sina Grace. And the moment in question was Iceman having a conversation around what it felt like to come out, and what it felt like to particularly come out as an older man. And there were a few different parts to that conversation. What I loved about it wasn't, oh, I've had this conversation, it's done. In previous issues, he'd had it with his parents. He'd had it with some of his exes with whom things didn't turn out, and the reason it didn't turn out is because they were women and he was trying to hide his sexuality. And he'd have those conversations again. And what I loved about it was that kind of very authentic feeling of coming out being a constant process, but also this very wonderful moment of actually saying, there's such a common criticism of why do you have to turn our characters gay? And there's this, it was a wonderful kind of inbuilt rebuttal of, well, actually, not all queer people are always out. Sometimes queer people discover themselves and we discover ourselves later in life. And it was this wonderful moment of just seeing that touched on quite an authentic way, which I think really was sold because of the fact that the creative team themselves were LGBTQ+. So that, that was the in-universe explanation. But the other reason I bring up this particular example is to kind of touch on a bit of comics history, because it is History Month. And the reality, of course, for a lot of characters who are now written as LGBTQ+ is that, particularly in the US, particularly in mainstream comic books, you couldn't have openly LGBTQ+ characters because of the Comics Code. My apologies for everyone who already knows this, but set up in 1954 and basically saying you could not have characters who were, to the sensibilities of the time, indecent or subversive, certainly not heroes. So villains could get away with it as long as they were getting their comeuppance. But what this did mean is that we saw a lot of subtext rather than overt queerness. And there were some instances where very brave editorial teams ignored the Comics Code. We did see some characters being openly LGBTQ+, and of course, as I mentioned, that was in the US. That didn't apply to every single comic book published in even the entire Western world. But it did mean that a lot of mainstream representation had to be quite covert. So I wanted to take a moment to actually reflect on that and ask my fellow panelists kind of whether this is from an academic perspective or a personal perspective, what do you think having that kind of representation be subtext? What do you think that's done for LGBTQ+ narratives? And obviously, how do you think that feeds into broader LGBTQ+ history? If we could take a moment to maybe reflect on that.
Actually, I was thinking of an answer as you were talking. Well, not an answer, but I was just thinking, I was contemplating how even when you have texts that are overt, you'll have pushbacks from people going, no, I don't see it like that. And so I don't know if maybe the subtext made it so that it's less accessible, that reading of LGBT narratives is less accessible. Or I mean, this isn't a graphic novel, but I saw an example a few days ago of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, when someone, I think on Tumblr or Twitter, was just outraged that someone had a homosexual reading to Dorian Gray, which is the book, right? But at the time, I guess it was subtext, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be a subtext. It's quite overt. And the response on Tumblr or Twitter was, this book was so gay that was used in the trial for the author's sodomy. So I think the subtext helps people close their eyes, helps people go, I'm not going to read it like that. I don't accept it like that. Even if the author comes out and says it, like for the Matrix franchise, they're like, oh, they're just doing it for marketing, for gimmick. It's a gimmick. And I think this subtext just helps people be more phobic. That's my personal opinion, I guess.
Yeah, it does. Oh, go ahead, Helena.
No, go ahead.
Well, weirdly, it reminds me of The Legend of Korra, which I don't know how many of you have seen, but that censorship hasn't gone away. Is as much as it starts in the comics and it existed in fiction before that. The fact that we had a show that recent that was still censored by Nickelodeon, where they could not have an overt lesbian relationship depicted between the two female characters, or I guess in this case bisexual relationship, because she'd been attracted to men before, but I identify as asexual. So at the end of it, I actually really enjoyed it, because I'm like, oh, it's like an asexual relationship. Because they were censored, it just ends up reading that way. It's like, oh, they're going to be like super great friends. That's what's happening there. And then you read the comic books, and in like issue 1, volume 1, straight out the gate. They're like, no, they are actually together. Like this is what we wanted to say, but couldn't. And I think that because we just have that legacy, and it's in so much of our comics, that people, as you say, it makes it easy to close your eyes so you don't see it, because you can just read over it, completely miss it. But it can also lead to sort of misreadings where, because we're so trained to look wherever we can find something that even vaguely resembles how we feel, we'll read it that way, even if it isn't meant to be that way, or it is meant to be that way, but they can't outright say that it is. And I think that's what a lot of that ends up doing. And then there's the flip side of that, where you've got queer baiting, where they know people enjoy the tension between two leads or two kinds of personalities. And so we'll tease that, but never go anywhere with it, which is its own kettle of stinky fish.
And I think the Legend of Korra is actually a perfect example for this, because when the show ended and I was like, they're obviously in love, like what else could it be? And then I would see like, and this is before, you know, the comics came out and before the creators actually confirmed that yes, they are together, like they are gay for each other, like there is no other explanation. And you would see like all on the message boards and everything, and people arguing, and most often, I mean, again, you know, cishet men saying no, they can't possibly be gay. And when it was confirmed and they couldn't, you know, deny the reality, they were like, well, it's so badly written, like it's so unbelievable that Korra and Asami could be together, like there's absolutely nothing in the rest of the show that leads up to that, it's so out of the blue. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but every single queer I know, including myself, like we were able to see every single hint that was dropped along the show, like the tension, the buildup of the tension between the two of them, and like everything. I mean, it's not, and it's something that yeah, I mean, going back to what you were saying, Chucky, about like the subtext, and like this, the subtext enables denial, right? Enables a kind of, it can allow for protection, obviously, you know, when you have censorship laws, obviously it's a way to communicate, you know, to those who have the codes, hey, you know, I'm here, I'm queer, so are you probably, if you can recognize, if you can pick up on what I'm saying, and we'll have our little, you know, private conversation while the rest of the mainstream readers are just like, you know, blathering out about heterosexuality. But in a context that, you know, is getting out of this censorship, subtext can really enable denial. And I mean, I'm seeing it. So I'm, my introduction to comics was by way of the Franco-Belgian bande dessinée, because my dad is a big fan. So, you know, I grew up with like the Asterix, the Tintin, like the you know, the big names of Franco-Belgian bande dessinée. And one of these was a series called Torgal, which is about this guy in like Nordic, you know, a Nordic setting and everything. And like looking back, I mean, I should have known, obviously, because I was more into, you know, the female characters than the male characters, you know, like, and they're supposed to be obviously the ones that I should be attracted to, right? But anyway, but what struck me really was rereading them now as a grown-up, then I'm seeing how heteronormative the whole thing is. Like the way they talk about Loki, the way that they talk about these gods is so heteronormative, and it's so, and the history of the Franco-Belgian bande dessinée does not have the same censorship laws as, you know, comics in the US setting, but you can see the heteronormativity that structures the way everything is represented, and obviously, you know, and like the way women, you know, obviously so many naked women, and so many naked women represented with a male gaze. And so it's not like even I was even able to enjoy that. I'm like, yay, you know, like clearly this is not, you know, for me, this is not intended for me, and this was written by a man for other men, and it's so much caught in the male gaze. So there's that history. But what I'm seeing also now is that there is this kind of because of the influence of I guess US, you know, representations, and in France we hate that, right? Like people are so adamant about the fact that we should not be influenced by US the US cultural sphere. But anyway, there is a kind of like liberation in graphic novels, especially. So they're not following the very strict formal codes of the bande dessinée, but they are definitely, you know, doing their own thing and integrating a French cultural vision of what, you know, queerness is like into the graphic novel form. So that's really exciting. And I'm hoping a few of the titles I have in mind will get translated into English at some point so they can reach a larger audience. But I'm really excited to see that there are, it's not just, US comics, US LGBTQ comics being translated into French. There is also French and Francophone from Quebec, from other French-speaking parts of the world. There is also a French-speaking, mass of cultural production that is being produced. So yeah, that's something I'm really excited about, and it may turn the tide a bit of a like ingrained heteronormativity in Franco-Belgian bande dessinée, that kind of world.
What was really exciting, sorry.
No, go ahead.
What was really exciting to kind of hear from all of your responses was the kind of variations as well in how censorship, even though, we do think about it from a largely kind of US-centric perspective, how that has also influenced in different contexts. And it draws me to my own kind of circumstances growing up in Bangladesh, where currently homosexuality is still illegal. Thank you, British colonialism. But we did get a lot of foreign imports in terms of the cultural scene, particularly in comic books. So we did get a lot of US comic books, and all of it was subtext at the time. But I distinctly remember when I was discovering my sexuality, reading the X-Men and going, oh, they're gay. They're gay. And, they may have other connections and other analogies, and of course there's the comparison to the US civil rights movement, but it's like, no, they're gay. And that from a closeted perspective, it was actually weirdly liberating. And of course the censorship law in that particular instance helped, because there was no way an overt LGBTQ comic would be sold in Bangladesh in the 90s. So it was really interesting as well, kind of seeing the two sides to the censorship coin, as it were, where on the one side it really enables the phobia and the denial, but on the other hand, it can create some forms of very specific, but very, very context-specific liberation. Becky, sorry, I interrupted you, but you were about to say something.
Yeah, it's just the thinking about like how this outside of America, when you think about queerness in comics, I read a lot of Japanese manga and watch a lot of anime, and Korean as well. And there is a subgenre within manga called BL, boys love. And it is just gay relationships and gay characters. However, its audience is women. It's specifically straight women, which is this very interesting concept that you can have such explicitly queer material, and there's like different levels where it goes from just like they never really go anywhere to explicit sexual content, which they have different names for. But the fact that the audience isn't actually queer, like this isn't for actual queer individuals, this is for straight women to essentially have a female gaze enjoying these men being with each other, although for a very long time they were very unhealthy relationships, and it's not the greatest. There's usually power dynamics and very much rapey in a lot of ways. And it, again, when you take it out of the context, if you think, oh, is this a reflection of Japan? No, it's not. They've only just barely made gay marriage legal, where instead partners would have to adopt each other in order to be together, because it just wasn't legal. And so the idea that we can have these representations and these relationships depicted just fine, but because it's for this audience, it makes it okay. If it was actually for a queer audience, then it wouldn't be, because those people are not allowed to actually like they're not permitted to perform any kind of actions of love and affection for each other within this country, within like a national context. And there are other issues within Japanese media when it comes to queer representation in general. They're not great with trans. They're not really great with a lot of any of those kind of news. They are getting better, but have a long history, in the same way that Western media does, as you mentioned, vilifying. It was fine for the bad guys to be trans, to be queer, to be gay, any of those things, to be like a strong lesbian villainous lady, like all of that was fine. But as you say, they got punished in the end. So their deviancy was punished, to again send the message like this isn't okay. And that those kind of interesting parallels you see between cultures and the media that they produce, I think, is something that now I think our media is getting a bit better, but even so, look at the stories that we tell, which is the reality of America in particular, not really accurate, unfortunately. It's not that great.
It's my favorite thing about queer coding villains in particular is, you know, the idea that they queer coded villains to make me hate homosexuality, but really I just have a crush on all the villains now, because that's what happened. It's really interesting as well to think about what you just said about audience and impact. And I was wondering if we could maybe take a moment to reflect on that aspect, because it isn't just queer readers who read queer comics, right? It's everyone. You know, if we go by kind of national demographic statistics, the vast majority of readers wouldn't probably self-identify as queer, you'd think. So it's kind of that aspect as well of how visibility and representation can have that kind of an impact, because we so again thinking to Bangladesh at the moment, so the 90s you didn't really have any queer comics in Bangladesh anyway, but recently a few community groups have kind of started exploiting the loopholes around what is representation versus what is actual homosexuality, because the law criminalizes homosexual intercourse, doesn't criminalize a fictional character being gay. So there's been it's still very niche, but there have been some local comic artists who've created kind of subversive characters, and not just queer characters, you know, characters expressing politically toxic topics, characters exploring things like Indigenous rights, and you know the artistic kind of defense being, well, it's a piece of art. I'm not actually saying this is who I am, but that's been really interesting, because what it's allowed is conversations around queerness in ways people weren't expecting, because a lot of people go, oh, I don't want us to talk about actual queer people. I don't have any queer people in my family, but that book's interesting. That comic book's interesting. I didn't realize that in one particular example, oh, I didn't realize that lesbians could cook. And it sounds like such an awful thing to say, but then it created this really interesting narrative around, well, actually, lesbians are just as human as the rest of us. But it was hilarious, but also weirdly powerful. And I'm just wondering if we could take that moment now to kind of reflect on those strange points where queer visibility can have sometimes unexpected impacts on non-queer readers. And if any of you have any examples that you can maybe think of as well.
I've been obsessed with Heartstopper recently. I could only get through my library and I was just devoured it in like 20 minutes. But I really like in Heartstopper where they're showing different audiences within the text itself. And so you have the LGBT community, and then you have the hetero community who's responding and going, oh, well, he doesn't really look gay to me, or, you know, and I like that overt depiction, I think, of this is why I think I devoured it, because it's so real to life of the process of coming out, and constantly trying to figure out, do I fit the stereotype of, you know, it's like, oh, but I'm not into ballet or something, so how can I be gay? You know, like things like that. And I think, so one of the things I do like about current comic representations is that they're showing so many different personalities within these identities. It's not just the stereotype. But when you go back to the stereotypical ones, where they're villainized and whatever, those are those overt stereotypes, I think, where they're and it was interesting because as you were talking about villains, I was thinking that usually I identify with the villains regardless of what's happening, because they're like, we're going to destroy capitalism, and it's like, yeah, let's do that. Like, let's do that. Is this a bad thing? Like, so it's interesting how superhero comics, especially, where they're trying to make this guy or person be so much of a baddie, but they actually have a noble goal in mind. And I think it's interesting how that correlates to any LGBT depictions, where it's like, maybe the LGBT characters are actually the good guys, and
I mean,
we should get on board with that. Sorry, say again.
Yeah, no, that reminds me of like Poison Ivy, where like I could never understand why she was a villain. I mean, she just wants to have plants everywhere. Is that a bad thing? Like, I still haven't figured that out. Plus, she's queer, so obviously.
Yeah, like, she's queer. She's like, let's save the world. You guys are destroying the environment. Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing with Poison Ivy, especially because you have Bruce Wayne, who's this billionaire who could just invest in the environment or in saving the world, and you have,
or just open a mental health hospital and not Arkham Asylum in Gotham City.
I mean, it's like so many bad choices, like so many bad life choices on Bruce Wayne's part, and then Poison Ivy is there, and she's like, basically, trees will fix everything. And I'm like, yes, that is the direction we should be going into. But what you were saying, Chucky, I mean, it's definitely I definitely share very, very similar views. And what you were saying about the audience citizen, it's I mean, going back to the example of like these boys love comics and everything, and I remember early on in college discussing these with this friend I had at the time, straight female friend, and she was so much into what fan fiction and yaoi in particular, so like homosexual male relationships, and there was so much like a fetishistic element to it, where the moment that it was switched like a lesbian relationship, then it was icky, but like gay relationships was fine, but lesbian relationship was just icky. And I'm just like, I think that it's why it's so important to have queer content created by queer creators, because then we can have visibility and representation that is a bit more diverse and a bit more authentic to what a queer existence is actually like. But at the same time, it can also, like, the audience obviously will not be only queer, and at some point I think that if straight people keep reading queer content created by queer creators, at some point they have to realize that our lives are not the stuff of a fetish. Our lives are not the stuff of like fantasies, and they're actually real lived experienced lives, and they're messy and they're complex. And I think that's what's so important in comics right now, that kind of representation allows us to be messy and complex and authentic, and it shows queer people as sometimes they're the good guys, and sometimes they're the bad guys, and sometimes they're in between and morally gray, and it's all over. And we're allowed to not just be pigeonholed, we're allowed also to not be the good guys, just to make sure that we come off as non-threatening, which is also, I think, really important. I mean, if I'm thinking of like She-Ra and the Princess of Power, where you could decently argue that every single character on that show, it's an animated show, every single character is some shade of queer. Like I don't think there is like a single cisgender heterosexual character on that show, except perhaps like the super bad guy, but like everyone else is some shade of queer, and not every single one of them is a good person, but they're all there. They're allowed to make bad choices and to be really messy and to have their redemption arcs or not, regardless of the fear of like, what if straight people are going to see us and think that this is the way that queer people are, and so they're threatening, they're villains, and so on and so on. I'm not sure that I'm really clear, but like I think to sum it up, basically, it's the messiness, the complexity of our experiences that's being rendered right now in the comics world. That's really exciting. Yeah, because it allows us to just be there and not have to think all the time about how the impact this is going to have on a straight audience.
Yeah, and it's like the Yuri equivalent of Boys Love does exist, but you're right. It's more overtly fetishistic. Not that Boys Love isn't as well, but it's reframed in that way where it's girl on girl for a certain audience's satisfaction again. But your messiness reminds me of Blue is the Warmest Color, which I can't say the title in French because of that. But it also shows a really messy lesbian relationship. It shows kind of like the fallout of that relationship, of somebody coming to terms with it and confronting parents who blame them for, like, it's very much a messy story. Funhouse does a similar thing where it's that kind of memoir story of just like coming to terms with how messy and her father's relationships were, in the way that he just wouldn't accept his attractions and the way he did act on some of his attractions and things like that. So we're definitely, I think, getting a lot more of these honest, messy stories. And we also get like the utopic happy stories, which are great. Like, it's nice, especially more in like the juvenile fiction for the younger audiences. It makes sense that you want to tell these more idyllic stories. And a lot of them still have those moments of conflict because those are the audiences that they're for. But as you kind of like move forward, you get more mess. You get more of that gray back and forth where it's just like you think this character's going to be your protagonist, but they're actually they're very anti-hero. Or in a lot of the like more real world settings and a lot of the graphic novel memoirs we've been seeing more and more of, it helps people kind of show the range where it's just like you can't distill any one of us into one box. And the graphic novel How to Be Ace was amazing for me because where I'm usually falling off in the plus somewhere if I'm on the spectrum when they do the letters and stuff, and to get that depiction is really problematic. And she, kind of like you were saying, Chucky, like they do in Hopstar, she does this thing where she works through all of the things people say to ace people, and what everybody thinks about asexuals, because it's hard to wrap your head around people who just don't feel sexual attraction, or they just don't feel it in the way that everybody else, like all of that kind of thing. And how it's just like, even within that, you have its own spectrum of straight, gay, bi within that, and all of that. And I feel like she did such a great job of approaching that for people who know absolutely nothing about it, whilst also sharing her own personal experiences. So like her struggling with depression and things like that. And I think a lot of these graphic novels are showing that, yeah, lesbians cook. It, like the idea that regardless of how you identify or what your orientation might be, you're still a human being. So you're still going to do all of the normal things you're going to have and struggle with, so many of the normal things that everybody's going to struggle with. And when it comes to audience and representation, this might be the only instance in their life that they know of actually encountering a person like this, of seeing that. And I mean, I remember the first book I read that had a gay character in it, and it blew my mind because it was just like, I never, met anyone who was up to that point when I was quite young. So reading that and knowing that, judging this character's story against everything I'd ever been told about, gay men and whatever, it changed how I thought about that, being like, that doesn't seem like that person. And because, books were my friends, this fantasy character was more real than this sort of like monster that had been painted for me. And that's, I think, why representation is so important, like an explicit representation. It's something I saw when people were looking at, like, if your kid is trans and you want to give them trans literature, like, they need to be the protagonist. They need to be human, not animal. It shouldn't be a metaphor. They shouldn't have to read a metaphor of who they are. They should be human. Like, thinking about it that way. And it's like, the metaphors are great. And I love sci-fi fantasy. I'm all about that. That is my genre. Love it. But I get where they're coming from, where it's like, starting out, they shouldn't have to identify with the other. They should just identify with the protagonist, the hero of the story, or a character in the story, And I think that's why it's a huge thing. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but there's so many picture books now that are LGBT friendly. And they're all great and emotional and beautifully drawn. And so I have a whole list of those if anyone wants. them. And yeah, didn't mean to interrupt, but just wanted to jump in to say if anyone has children who want to see more representation, I do have resources.
I remember the hoopla of Tango, where it was about the penguin.
Tango makes two.
Tango makes two. I remember when that first came up.
Tango makes three.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's like I remember when that was published and the hoopla people threw about these two male penguins that had the audacity to look after a baby.
I know.
I mean, it reminds me of the episode in Parks and Recreation where there was like a similar storyline, right? Where like she goes, like, the zoo has these two penguins and the protagonist hosts, because she works at City Hall, she hosts like a fake wedding between these two penguins, and they turn out to be male. So all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, so you're for gay marriage. So basically all the penguins in the town just, going after her. And it's a whole mess. And I mean, I have, my fair share of criticism about how the storyline is handled, but it's just like, it's like, or just penguins are like, penguin homosexuality apparently is matters a lot to human beings, apparently.
Well, this was based on a real live event, so that's what it's like.
And Tango Makes Three is a true story, and my favorite part about that is that Tango has grown up to be what we would call queer herself. So there's that.
It's all over the animal world. Like if you take 10 seconds to look into this, like almost every kind of animal has instances of this.
It's
so the argument that somehow it is unnatural. I'm like, have you seen nature? They literally.
But also it's just like, it's unnatural. You're saying that on a phone that someone made, which doesn't happen in nature. It's just calm down.
On the other side of the animals getting together, A Day in the Life of Marlon Bundo. I don't know if anyone's heard of it, but Marlon Bundo is Mike Pence's bunny rabbit, so it's the vice president's official rabbit, and the author imagined that the rabbit is gay and wanted to get married. And it's just brilliant. It's just beautiful. So this obviously didn't happen, but I like how they took a real life animal and imagined this backstory to them.
So I'm actually sorry, but I'm because I also I appreciate that we need to make sure we've got on time. But I did want to jump on one final point, and I think, Chucky, the example you just gave is a really great way to do it, because we talk a lot. We've talked a lot about kind of the histories of LGBTQ plus visibility. We have talked quite wonderfully and importantly about LGBTQ plus people telling our own stories, because we need to. But I'm also wondering about, the kind of LGBTQ plus ethos in stories that aren't LGBTQ plus, and not even from a subtext perspective. So, you mentioned, for example, Chucky, the points around superheroes. Well, I found that a lot of Marvel and DC books that are written by queer creatives tend to be so much more critical of things like capitalism and the patriarchy and things like that. So, if you read the current run of Nightwing, for instance, although the writer is quite famous right now for helping Superman's son come out as bisexual and talk about the fact that he's the son of a refugee, but he's also doing Nightwing, and Nightwing completely flips the whole idea of the adopted child of a billionaire on its head. And you get the feeling that the reason that is because at least part of the creative team is queer. So I'm just wondering as well whether that you think there's that power as well of LGBTQ plus writers and creatives telling not only LGBTQ plus stories, but telling stories that are politically queer.
Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, thank you. I just, it's really quick, but I mean, I'm really torn on this one, because I do think that, yes, like there is a queer ethos, and obviously that queer ethos is politically oriented toward, destroying capitalism and destroying white supremacy and destroying patriarchy, because all of these are linked, obviously. So if you take down one, you have to take down the others. They're not, you can't just do part of the liberation work and not, commit to a fuller to the fullest scope of the liberation work. But at the same time, I mean, I've seen it in France, I've seen it in the US, I've seen it in a couple of countries where I've been. There are people who identify as queer or as lesbian or as gay who are very conservative, not to say fascistic in their political outlook. And this, I mean, here in France, the leader of the far right party, Marine Le Pen, her like one of the most emblematic people in that party is a gay man, and he's not, you know, hidden about it. You know, he's not hiding his sexuality. Everybody knows that he's gay, but he weaponizes queerness in order to appeal to people who, you know, think of themselves as, oh, I just happen to be gay, but, you know, I'm going to espouse far right fascistic worldviews. So I do want to believe that there is like a queer ethos, and that queer ethos is directed toward the liberation of everyone, and toward, you know, justice, social justice and equality in that. And I do believe that that is reflected in the form, in the way that, you know, queer stories or non-queer stories are told by queer creators. But I'm wary of like essentializing queerness. And I'm not saying that, you know, obviously you didn't do that, but like I've heard enough people, you know, essentialize queerness and weaponize it, and the same thing happens to feminism, where feminist discourses are being weaponized to promote absolutely hateful and destructive worldviews. So I see there is a queer ethos, but we always that this is where I'm thinking that, you know, gatekeeping and, you know, thinking about, you know, what queerness means right now to a certain person and not let it go undefined is really important, because it means, you know, it is not, the stakes are really high, because the stakes are political liberation for everyone.
Yeah.
I think we have to be careful not to lump all authors as hetero, not hetero. Because I was also thinking about this, is that there are some great comics by hetero authors that don't fetishize the LGBT community. And I see it as a bit like similar to race, where it's like you could orientalize the racial other, or you could just include them in a way that representation matters, and be sensitive about it, and just be like, yeah, these people exist in society. Why wouldn't they be in this world? Like that kind of and that's, I think, what we want to get to is normalizing it. Of it's just, yeah, this exists. These identities exist. We exist as people in this world, and we need to be represented by everyone in a way that's not fetishized, in a way that's not damaging and stereotypical, but is in a way that is normal. And I hope more people, as they become more aware and conscious, I mean, authors and creators, that they engage sensitivity readers more than they have perhaps done in the past, because I feel like some early depictions of LGBT written by hetero authors were just glamorized and promoted, because it's like, oh, look, they got a depiction, you know, like, yay, us.
We're
and
finally
it's like,
there.
It's like, did you actually run this by like somebody who is queer to see what they think about the depiction? Because my big example is Grant Morrison's Earth One, which is just like their lesbian relationships is so fetishized, and it's just applauded for like showing showing these relationships. But it's like, well, no, this is the male gaze. These are lesbian relationships through the male gaze. Did you actually run this comic through someone who might identify as a lesbian, right? And so I don't see a problem with authorship. I see a problem with sensitivity readers. Have you engaged a sensitivity reader?
And also, I guess as well, sorry, but just to definitely point out as well, like that extends not only just generically to LGBTQ plus identity, as all of us said, and as Heloise, you said explicitly at the very beginning of your introduction, you know, none of us are a universal LGBTQ plus experience, right? So it's how, you know, you won't get the same kind of experience from someone talking about Wonder Woman's queerness as you would about, say, Nubia's queerness, who is a Black trans woman in the same universe. And you won't get what it's like for Wiccan, who's raised by Jewish parents and has Romani heritage. And you won't get the same thing with Iceman, who's white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right? So it's about understanding the diversity of our lived experiences and respecting that. Oh, I've got one gay friend who said it's okay. Did you? Well, first of all, did you though? But also, really?
Yeah.
But yeah.
And you see that.
It's also.
I was just going to say, you see that in diversity panels where they have a
Mm.
diversity panel in anything, you know, in hiring boards, in some sort of committee where it's like 5 old white men, and then you have this one single person, right? And then it's like, oh, we're being diverse, and it's like you're calling yourself a diversity panel.
But let's also not pretend that within the queer community everyone gets along. There's notorious internal discrimination, and it's sort of like everybody has to baby step, even within. Just because you're an oppressed minority doesn't mean you can't oppress another minority, kind of thing. And it's just the way that we see discrimination against trans individuals, the unacknowledgement of bi people, where it's just like, oh, they were straight and now they're a lesbian, instead of just being like, oh no, they were bi the whole time. In some cases it is that we thought they were straight and now they identify as lesbian, but other times they actually are equally, you know, they are attracted to both. And some of it is just, we don't yet have the kind of media language that fully accepts and knows how to present these more nuanced orientations and types of depictions. Because like, if you have an asexual character, like, unless they outwardly say it, you wouldn't know that they were, because it is literally just, you never see them hooking up with anyone, or you don't see them having the kind of relationships that you think that they're going to have. So it's easy to sort of read someone like the Doctor in Doctor Who as being ace for a while, or a lot of the characters who are just too busy to actually like have relationships in a lot of comics, where it's like those superheroes, they ain't got time for partners. So it's like, oh, maybe they're ace. But again, it's understanding, as you say, with that sensitivity, that applies within the community as much as it does without, because we get those degrees of just misunderstanding, of misrepresenting, and that kind of thing. And it's great that we're getting the range of depictions that we are within graphic novels specifically. Unfortunately, it's mostly on the indie side. We have broken into the Marvel and the DC universe finally. Too much grumbling off to the side there, but it's still very much within indie space that we're getting these characters occurring. Like, that's, if you Google queer comic books and graphic novels, you're going to get indie ones. You're not going to get, oh, Marvel issue this and DC issue that. They're there, but most of them are still off the mainstream kind of thing. And a lot of that is just because America itself still doesn't quite fully commit to it. And I'm sure Britain is in a similar vein of not fully just being like, okay with that yet.
Oh, we've got them. It's fine. It's you get a Pride issue once a year. Hooray. You get History Month and that's it. But you know, it's
yeah.
I think we'll be opening to audience questions in a moment, but I think what we've covered, I guess, is the fact that it's a complex and ongoing conversation. And it's really great that it's a conversation that has evolved. We are having some parts of the conversation that have moved forward. We're having some parts of the conversation that we didn't even have a decade ago. And even though they're frustrating parts of the conversation, I'm glad that we're finally having them. So I think it's, on the whole, I like to view it as a positive step. But then on days like this, I am a massive optimist. So who knows? But I think it's really important that we continue to speak about these and promote and uplift voices, which is really exciting. So we're not done yet, but the panel side of it is, and I'm going to open. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one last comment.
Of course.
I just wanted to note that with ace relationships, it's really difficult to depict, because usually in a narrative, the happy ending is a romantic relationship.
Oh God, yeah.
Right? That's the reward. So how are we supposed to reward this character? And I think that's where the struggle comes in, because people can't, that's the biggest struggle, is you can't phantom that. How are we going to reward this person? And so I just wanted to say that's
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just, again, that nuance is tricky. So it's like, how do you, unless the character explicitly is just like, oh, by the way, I'm bi, how do you explicitly know that, oh, they both, not just from one to the other or a spectrum? You know, a lot of it is that if they don't explicitly label, again, we're so used to the subtext that we just sort of read what we want to read.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Really, I loved being part of that. It was really great, and I'm so glad that we were able to kind of talk about moments that meant a lot to us as well as individuals, as well as kind of people who are approaching this from academic/professional perspectives. I'm going to open it up to an audience Q&A now. So for those folks who weren't able to be there at the beginning when we did a bit of housekeeping, you are very welcome to just raise your hand and we'll come to you and you can unmute yourselves. And if you want to put yourself on camera, that is absolutely fine. And we'll get to your question. If you would rather ask it, if you don't want to unmute yourselves or you're having any audio equipment issues, please put it in the chat. If you want it to be anonymous, please direct your question in the chat button to our wonderful moderator, who will see your name, but who will read the question out anonymously. What we would ask as well is if you could, if you have a preference, if you're directing the question at a specific panelist, or if you're asking all four of us or asking just a couple of us, if you could say so, that would be great. But we're going to open the floor to questions now. And I know that there have been some conversations already in the chat, which has been great. But please do ask away. Any takers?
Chucky's just giving us so many good recommendations.
I know, it's just I'm loving
and Heloise as well, getting those.
You could, once we're at the end there, you could save the chat onto your own folder. So if you're scrambling to write down names, you could just save the chat, and that'll be probably be easier. But
and if in case anyone who is a guest is not able to save the chat for any permission reasons, please don't worry. We at LGBT Foundation will be saving the chat. So if you do need us to kind of collate the recommendation, the recommended reading list, we will do that as well. So don't worry too much if you are unable to yourself. But yes, any questions or any questions that the panelists have for each other as well, that would be great. But take it away, folks.
While we wait for a question to come up, I just said, because I haven't mentioned it yet, and so I have absolutely to mention it. But Lumberjanes, that series, like for LGBTQ representation, it does so much work. It's so great. It's so nice. I mean, you've got lesbian, bisexual, yes. There you've got, representation of trans girls and non-binary characters and questioning characters regarding your gender identity. And it's really sweet and it's really cute. And what I really loved about it is that it, all the characters, whether they're queer, or genderqueer or whatever, they're there. It's not about their gender identity. It's not about their sexuality. It's there. It is a part of them. It is a part of their identity that you cannot, neglect or erase or whatever. But it's not the focal point. It's not like there's not an entire volume about like, oh my God, look, that girl is trans and we're going to make it all about her. We learned that she's trans because there's a conversation where she mentions that, because of who she used to identify as, or I don't know, like, she may have some experience being, on the boys, because it's about like a summer camp. So she may have had some experience being on the boys' side of the camp. But that's all. And it's really done in a way where, it shows that you have queer creators, reading and writing it. And it is done so in a manner that's so sensitive and so cute. So yeah.
Yeah, Stevens's earlier Nimona was the first I'd read of their work, and Nimona was brilliant. Like reading this story where you've kind of got like your villain character and his relationship with the hero knight, and the fact that it's like, wait, oh, they're in love. Oh, like just this simple little twist on what you expect is going to be these fantasy tropes that isn't, and her unique art style just lending itself to all of that. And I know I'm always recommending Nimona to like absolutely everyone. I'm just like, you need to read this. It's so good.
So we had a question come in.
Cool.
I'm just going to read out. Thank you very much for sending this in. I'm just reading it out. I'm a retired comics artist from France and have met a lot of misogyny and queerphobia when I was publishing there. What do you think could be done to force publishers to publish actual queer people or AFAB creators in a country that still privileges white cis men? This is coming from a specific context, but if anyone would like to respond to that.
Publishing's tricky.
Yeah.
I
I
mean,
mean, yeah, it can be a mix of what we're seeing with a lot of the indie publishers over here, where some of it is the comics they're soliciting. They're deliberately asking for this kind of content. And some of it can be that, where it's just like they need to have a staff. And this is for most of the media that we encounter in the world. If the people on the staff that control what gets made don't care about that, it's not going to get cared about. But if they choose to look for specific stories by specific people, or just open to anyone, as long as they're telling like these kinds of stories, that's how those stories get made and they get told. There's always that sensitivity about like, well, do we want to try to censor things? Do we want to try to force people to write the stories that we want to hear? No, that's not necessarily the answer. But I think, as sort of Chucky said earlier, having sensitivity, having accountability when you think about the stories that you're telling and the audiences that you're publishing this towards, that I think would be a big part of it. But it's very much on that industry and the people who buy those products, in the same way that like any capitalist society works. You want change, you have to show them there's an audience for it. So as long as it's profitable, they'll probably make it because they like making money. And so a big part of it is that it's just, there needs to be a proven audience to them, or at least there needs to be a proven audience aversion to what they have been doing wrong. And this is why it's so slow to change.
probably also easier if you're writing an Anglophone, because I mean, I'm Canadian. I could just go to a US or UK publisher if I can't find one in Canada, where it's the language barrier, which is more difficult because you just have fewer options with publishing houses as well.
A piece of, sorry, Alice, you go first, please.
Yeah, sorry. No, I mean, the thing is also in France specifically, like there is such rampant hypocrisy about queerness and queerphobia. And I mean, having seen both sides of, the US and France, sometimes people don't actually believe me, but I mean, like, it's easier to have, conversations in the US about stuff like queerness than it is in France. Because France has this, there are two things. France has this image of itself, as like the country of human rights, country of enlightenment, blah, 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 conveniently erasing the entire history of colonialism and genocide and just, all around awfulness. But that's one thing. So there is a very strong tendency to deny that bad stuff is happening in France and that the state is doing that bad stuff. Like the state is actually actively committing like denying human rights to part of the population. And that goes, I mean, for queerness, that also goes for gender, that also goes for race, obviously. I mean, this is a country that does not want to utter the word race, not because, it is strongly against racism, but because it does not acknowledge that, there is race as a social construct and that it is embedded in the way that the state, organize and regulates populations. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that lately, I mean, especially in like the past decade, there have been several moments when you have had like strong cultural turning points. And a few years ago, the entire movement to legalize same-sex marriage was one of them, where basically all of the conservative, uber Catholic people came out of the woodwork to explain how much they hated queers, basically. And it was a moment where once again, things were looking up and all of a sudden you felt unsafe again. And that has continued until now, where we are having, you know, obviously, you know, politicians and people like public intellectuals claiming that they're being censored, claiming that, you know, the wokeism movement from the United States is, you know, tearing down the fabric of French culture, and using that as a Trojan horse to basically bash minorities of all kinds without having any kind of accountability. So it doesn't seem like it, but I think that it's queer phobia in France right now is a lot more dangerous and threatening that it might have been like 10 years ago, precisely because there is this kind of racists and homophobes are basically feeling that they can, you know, they're feeling very empowered to spew hatred, and they're seeing that validated on a public national stage. So that repercussion, I'm not sure that even if it was a proven audience for queer comics, for example, in France, I'm not sure that they would actually move with that, because so much of the public discussion, the public national discussion and conversation around queer rights and around, you know, the rights of other minorities as well, is being, I would even say, held hostage by those public intellectuals and politicians who are making sure that, you know, all you can hear is that they're being censored. The only thing you hear is their voice and their views. So yeah, it's
there is one a flip side of this is, like, if we go beyond the publishing houses, because of the internet, we have the wonder that is things like Kickstarter. We have public funding project systems now that allow people to break beyond traditional forms of media production and distribution. So if you wanted to make a French queer comic book, you can do it. It is still limiting, because your ability to PR this thing is a very big part of the success of a campaign like that. But it does create opportunities for authors. Like, a lot of the independent authors, they didn't get their start with a lot of publishing houses. A lot of them are starting through Kickstarters, independent projects, things like Patreon and stuff as well, which allow them to not have to depend on something that can limit them to be able to tell these stories.
And oh, sorry, but I do just want to quickly jump in as well and add. First of all, thank you very much, Eloise, for that very French context. It, you know, the textures and the nuances of queerphobia are very different from country to country. But I will also say, it's you know, coming from Bangladesh, where we don't get as many opportunities about this, and the kinds of the comic books that I mentioned earlier, although they have been published, they were very underground efforts, and they kind of took off in the mainstream after being underground efforts rather than being picked up by big publishing houses from the get-go. I think there's also sometimes real value in figuring out maybe indirect channels where you have solidarity and built-in support systems, because what I would never advocate is putting yourself in a space where you are feeling burned out as an individual. I say that from a professional perspective as well, from, you know, from an Lgbt Foundation perspective, where it's not on you it's not on you as an individual to change the system. It's part of us collectively to do so. So kind of finding those spaces where perhaps there is an in that isn't traumatic, or there is an in that isn't quite as challenging. And I'm very grateful for our panelists for kind of mentioning some of this as well, because we're going to make sure that we put that up. And I will also say, on that point, Chucky has very graciously agreed to let us share the Discord server for the Fantastica community, that the journal that Chucky so wonderfully edits, and Eloise will be co-editing, I guess, the next issue. So I'm pretty sure that if there are any questions that we can continue on there as well, that would be really great. I think that's just as important. So I did want to put that up.
I was just going to say that I think there's a lot of authors and creators now who started as web comics and then got picked up. And I mean, Tilly Walden's On a Sunbeam is, I think, a prime example of that, where it's won awards now, but it started off as a serialized comic on the web. And because of the webcomic, if you can reach a global audience, that has probably more traction than showing that you're influential in your local community or country. I think that would be one way to go about it.
The downside of that is the exploitative market that is webcomics, because
Yes.
so much of it is they're not compensating these authors,
no.
which is why you get all those hiatuses where they're like, my arm is on fire because I have to meet these deadlines. I'm not making any work, so I'm doing it in my downtime.
Which is why, following on from Iptism's, don't burn yourself out.
Yeah.
Please.
Make sure
support artists. If you like their stories and you like what they do, find a way to support them. We've had a question in the chat.
I have noticed, so I kind of love this one. Admittedly a lighthearted question, but I also came to comics through the X-Men and read them all as gay. Who do you think is the most obviously queer mutant that hasn't been acknowledged as queer on panel yet? Now, my thing with the X-Men is I see Charles Xavier and Eric Lehnsherr as a divorced gay couple fighting over custody of their kids. So there's that. But I also do think with the new kind of setup for the X-Men, where they now have their own island nation, which is being set up as a safe space for mutants, and there's so much queer ethos there. It's really interesting seeing the evolution of the love triangle between Jean Grey, Wolverine, and Scott, because it was obviously set up as this uber macho, no, she's mine conversation. And there's so much of a polyamorous vibe there for me. I would love to see the three of them as a throuple, but also, I mean, there's kind of hints at it, because there was a period when they were building up this new island nation where one of the things that they did was the artists came together and they started creating like blueprints for houses, for like what mutant houses look like. And one of it was 3 bubbles, where the central bubble was Jean, and she had rooms that led to both Scott and Wolverine's. But they also had a little corridor where they could go and talk to each other as well. And that's not fan art. That's in, you know, that's part of the actual creative team. And I think what's exciting about that is it's showing more different ways of thinking about relationships, where it's not just, oh, you know, it's not just, oh, I'm gay, but I'm still like monosexual and monogamous. And there's nothing wrong with that as someone who is monosexual and monogamous. But it's exciting to be like, you're thinking about fantasy worlds and you're thinking about mutants creating their own society. Why wouldn't you rethink things like family structures? So that made me super excited, and I hope that becomes explicitly canon very soon, if for no other reason than I want to see people getting angry about Wolverine can't be gay. Yes,
he's been like how long? Like, it's been how long? Surely
they wear spandex. They're okay.
I know, right? I do like that it is giving Jean Grey more agency.
As well.
A lot of what happens in these things, unfortunately, is like you'll have this amazing kick-ass lady, but she's entirely defined by the love and the romance. Like that is like the most important thing that they bother with her character, instead of giving her arcs and stories apart from the freaking drama, where it's just like, if it's just like, you know what, tonight I fancy some Wolverine. Tonight, oh, now I'm feeling some Scott. Like, if she's the one making the choice, where it's like they're her husbands, she's not their wife. Like, if that's how that wants to go, and the two guys are just like, you know what, we're good with that. Like, respecting her autonomy in that way would be nice and novel to see. But it is something that does miss me a lot, when especially it comes to like super powered women, where it's just like, oh no, we've made them too threatening. Quick, give them romance and triangles.
Well, that's just it with Jean Grey, isn't it? It's all the time she's you know, the most powerful mutant and the conduit for the Phoenix Force, but every time she uses it too much, she faints.
Great, love drama.
I mean, to be quite honest, like, I'm sorry, but like the whole thing, you know, you were saying like the machismo between Scott and Wolverine. I mean, I'm sorry, like, perhaps again, it's because I'm a lesbian, but like, I cannot see that kind of storyline without thinking, oh my God, you just kiss already, okay? This is not about just kiss, get it out of your system. I mean, clearly there is something going on between you two. Get a room, and then we'll discuss this as, you know, adults, and you can go on with your throuple or whatever. But like, clearly like the one upping each other. I mean, how homoerotic can you get? At some point, you have to just like acknowledge it, and
Oh, totally.
yeah, I mean, seriously.
We have a comment in the chat saying the dynamic is very Sedgwick. And I feel that way about all relationships where the female's trying to decide between these two males. And I'm sick and done with that. But it's like, yeah, let's just lean into it and go that homoerotic throuple route. And that would be great if we could see more of that rather than this like heteronormative decision that this female has to make.
Or, you know, she shows up and the guys are fighting, and she just like walks by in the background holding hands with a lady, and they just like stop and are like, we've been replaced. What's just happened? She's like, guys, I'm tired of the drama.
I would love that if that was
me and Jubilee, we're gonna hang out over here now.
Oh yeah.
I want to see that now. So I'm sure it's in fan art and fan fiction, but I really want to see this on the official creation of like, Jean Grey hooks up with somebody else, just completely random.
Watch the X-Men space. Just a comment as well from our lovely moderator who just went, I just googled Logan X-Men queer to find that one panel of Wolverine and Kurt hinting at a relationship, and it's all results for is Wolverine going to end up with Cyclops. I mean, it is also, it's worth noting from specifically the X-Men perspective of like Iceman's coming out, a lot of that was because so many queer readers were just like,
come on, guys.
Oh, he can't hold on to a relationship with women. I wonder why. So some of it is also, and I feel like sometimes, particularly with long-running comic books where the creative teams change on a regular basis, there is that beauty sometimes of like enough fan pressure being like the writers going, oh, I hadn't thought about that, maybe I should. Because I love the X-Men. There is no way Iceman was explicitly written as gay in the 60s, but it makes sense now. So anyone who dates Polaris,
right?
Yeah.
But I mean, it's especially when you get immortal characters like Wolverine, it opens up so many doors to talk about moments in history where those voices have not been heard. Like if he was in the World War, a lot of gay relationships happened between soldiers, particularly in World War I. And then when they went home, they were just told to be straight again, that it was fine during the war, but not anymore. Yeah. And there's loads of memoirs and poems you can read about these relationships and what these men went through. And so it'd be great to use a character like that and tell that kind of a story where it's just like, not only are we getting, our beloved Wolverine doing his fun Wolvie adventures, but you get a nice history story, and to have that lens of, hey, maybe this is why he's never talked about it, because this is what it was like. And this is how hard they told them to shut up about it. Like that kind of internalized oppression, like how amazing would that story be? In the same way that
have this lost love. I'm all tragic for him now.
Yeah, and it would change everything the way that it changed Eric's character when you made him a victim of the Holocaust. It reframes him from just being an asshole to an asshole with a reason, that when you tell him certain things, they're going to be triggering as all heck. And it just adds a greater depth than the one dimensional, like, he's antagonistic because we need an antagonist. Instead, it's like, no, he's antagonistic because he's been through this and he sees it happening again. And so, yeah, he's going to have an extreme reaction to that. And I think that's the kind of way that these authors could take these characters in this way, where it gives you these endpoints and these stories that you could tell that you can't otherwise. And that's, I think, a bit of a missed opportunity, but is starting to happen a bit more. And I'm really glad to see the changes that are happening.
Absolutely. We're not, if it's okay with folks, we're not going to take any more audience questions. I do apologize. It's one of those things where there aren't enough hours in the day when you're having fun. We do have a few minutes, but what I'm going to do is, first of all, Chucky, if you wouldn't mind sharing the Discord link and there we go. For folks, this is also something that will be sent round in an email later on. So again, no worries if you are not able to copy things down right now. What I will also be doing, and again, this is going to go out later on in an email, is just dropping a very quick form from LGBT Foundation about the event. Please feel free to fill it in. It would be really grateful. It would be really great, and I would be very grateful if you were able to, because it helps us to make sure that we can continue to run more events such as this. We're able to show a kind of, look, people enjoyed this, or even people liked this, but there were things we could do better. We do have a couple of minutes, and I actually want to end on another personal question that we discussed early on in the kind of prep room that the four of us as panelists had. And Becky, I'll let you go first because I'm aware that you need to leave on the dot. But we discussed kind of favorite moments, and we've discussed a lot of really crucial things and like wish list moments of what we'd like. Would you be okay to share a moment which you found empowering for whatever reason? It could be something as simple as the dialogue was nice to something a lot more, you know, conventionally speaking, profound. But if we could just take a moment to do that, because I would love for our audience to kind of go away as well on that wholesome note, I guess.
Yeah, there's so many things that I think about when it comes to these ones, but I actually came to find the How to Be Asexual because my housemates bought it because I was moving in with them, and there's some friends of mine, and they actually wanted to educate themselves on asexuality. And so reading that and seeing how she is so honest and upfront with her experience and how she understands it and the perspectives and all of like the things, that was incredibly amazing kind of for me to read, to get to, it's that feeling that I'm sure all of us have had where it's like you realize you're not the only one who feels that way. That it's just like, oh, I'm not crazy, this is a thing other people experience. And whilst her experience of asexuality and her specific orientation within it is different from mine, it was still great to see that and to have it presented in that way. I mean, mostly I've been reading the Very Wholesome Tea Dragon Society, which I cannot promote enough because it's just amazing. And within that, so many of the relationship, because it is for juvenile audience, so there's no like really explicit content. The relationships in that are similarly just like these beautiful, intimate, close friendships that are amazing. And I'm just like, oh, I love it. So for me, those are definitely, and it's the kind of thing where it's like, these are the utopias that ideally we all want to see and read and have happen. And something I'd like to see more of, and though I still also love Monstrous, which is, if you haven't read it, amazing art. It's almost entirely woman populated world of like human and animals, and the fierceness of that character and everything she goes through, and just everything in that story has just been so brilliant, and the hybridity, and I've written about it as well, and it's just like so good. Like, everyone read this. That, yes, Mom, let me look at this. Look how beautiful it is.
It is absolutely gorgeous.
So gorgeous.
Like,
so gorgeous.
Every page is art.
Yeah, I talk about artist hands. I'm like, how do you do this, woman?
Yeah.
Like, oh my goodness, the intricacies.
I know, like this one doesn't even have text in it, and you're just like, I could just stare at it for ages, trying to like.
I would hang that on my wall.
Yeah.
I would totally hang
Yeah.
Chucky,
I've got her.
Eloise, either of you two want to have a go as well?
Louise, you go first because I'm still thinking.
Well, I was coming on you to go first, so I could still think.
Well, how about Iptism goes next? Then?
Okay, I'm happy to. I'm happy to. For me, it's actually a really minor thing, but it actually meant a lot, which is why I want to mention it. So in a lot of the recent art for Billy Kaplan / Wiccan in the Marvel comics, and if anyone hasn't read the comics, if you've watched WandaVision, he's one of Scarlet Witch's twins, who is gay. So is his brother, by the way, so 2 for 2. He's drawn with chest hair, and this sounds like such a tiny thing to say, but as a queer person of color who grew up with such a complicated relationship with body hair, particularly around kind of the conversations around what makes someone attractive, what is considered desirable. And particularly if you look at superhero comics and even superhero films, kind of the clean shaven, uber muscular body types that you see a character whom I've already loved because he tackles things like mental health and minority stress, to then also be like, yeah, he's got chest hair. It's tiny, but it's one of those things which I really connected with. And I think it's again the fact that he's drawn by a queer person of color, who would understand that this isn't just this isn't just a random aesthetic choice. It means something. And that's what really hit me in a wonderful and surprisingly poignant way. So that's what I'm going to say.
I mean, I definitely see how you mean that, because ladies are smooth everywhere.
Oh yeah,
in
yeah.
everything. Yeah,
You could have
we're still waiting to see.
You could have crash landed in the middle of an apocalyptic island, and like
And somehow
everything would have been ruined, but somehow.
Yeah, we have makeup and we still shave.
Oh yeah, yeah.
One exception is Disney's Tarzan, who I don't understand why Disney's Tarzan is clean everywhere, right?
But it's because the apes just pluck his hairs to keep him keep the lice down. You know, that must be it.
I mean, but that is that is why I just like post-apocalyptic narratives. That part of my dissertation is about the apocalypse and the motif of the apocalypse in literature. So post-apocalyptic narratives are my jam. But all the time, I'm just like, really, like, you expect me to believe this, like, on screen, that she's going to be so pretty. Like, obviously, yes, I do enjoy looking at pretty women, even in post-apocalyptic settings. But like, this goes way beyond what's believable for me. But yeah, I've picked my empowering moment. So you still have a couple of seconds, Chucky, to
but before you do, thank you so much for your time, Becky. Love you so very much.
It's been great talking with all of you. I hope we all can continue on Discord. Everybody talk on Discord so I can still keep talking.
Thank you.
So mine is actually, I have a couple, but the one I'm going to pick for right now is it can sound pretty conventional, but it was Fun Home. Reading Fun Home, and I read Fun Home long after I came out, long after I started the whole process of thinking, hey, maybe I'm not all that straight, and I'm learning so much and relearning so much about myself. But the moment I read Fun Home was 6 years ago now, 5.5 years ago, summer 2016. It was for a class in this summer school, and it just illuminated so many things in retrospect. In particular, the moment when she's, and it was the moment when that summer Fun Home was turned into a Broadway musical, and they made a whole song about the scene when small Allison is with her father in a diner, and she sees this dyke, like super butch woman, just walking into the diner and talking with the owner, and she is just so herself. She exists as herself in that space. She is clearly not straight. She is clearly queer. Like, she fits the butch stereotype, but that's when you see that, hey, stereotypes are not always a bad thing. Like, she is herself. She's not thinking about, whether she fits a stereotype or not. And the song in the Broadway musical is called, I think, like A Ring of Keys or something, because she has a ring of keys, hanging on her belt loop. And that small detail, just like small Allison, both it's more subtle in the comic, in the book, than in the musical. The musical does a big thing about that, but still, like, small Allison just zeroes in onto that ring of keys, and that becomes her thing, where she's like, I see myself, I see who I could become. And unlike what her father says, it's a picture of a great future. It could be because it's authentically her. And so that moment, I was just reading, the thing, because, everyone was telling me, you have to read this. It's a monument of queer literature, and especially like lesbian literature. So you have to read that. I was like, okay, I guess I will. And then, like, that moment, I was just like, it's so unlike my own storyline, right? My own narrative. but it helped me that in that moment just illuminate in retrospective so many moments when I was a child and when I was a teenager, where I was like, how could I ever think that I was straight, you know? And it's bittersweet because at this one, like on the one hand, you're realizing that you were always who you were, that you didn't, you know, you were not turned by, you know, gay by fellow, you know, gay people. But at the same time, it's like, how do you make up for years lost to like enforced heterosexuality, heteronormativity? So that was like a very bittersweet moment when reading Fun Home, because it was so empowering, and at the same time it made me feel sad for, yeah, and I think that is a shared sentiment by a lot of people that I've read this with, like the years lost, like how do you make up for that, and the anger also at being in a way robbed of, you know, your teenagehood, when you could have had so many fun times, so many experiences, so many moments of wonder and amazement, and you were robbed of that, because you were still, you know, trying to figure out what your place was in the world, and you were desperate when you were subconsciously realizing that that place did not match what people had in mind for you. So yeah, Fun Home. Yes, Alison Bechdel. I'll pop it in the chat.
Thank you
wanna give
so,
you a
so
hug
much for sharing
now.
that. Yeah, virtual hugs, virtual hugs.
Virtual
Olga.
hugs. I'll end on a happier note, because I think we should. But mine's probably a weird, not an overtly LGBT thing. I enjoy how many of these comics graphic novels with LGBT characters have a friendly relationship, a found family relationship. I'm thinking of Lumberjanes and On a Sunbeam and Paper Girls, and just how much outside of the romantic relationships, the characters just love and support each other. And that, I think, I found the most rewarding part of any of these graphic novels is just the community and the relationships and the friends coming together. And it's not necessarily to do with LGBT, because some of these characters can be straight and whatnot, but just having that friendship circle, I think, is really big, profound. Yeah, so that's mine.
Well, thank you very, very much. And thank you to everyone who stayed slightly longer than the event was going to be, but we really appreciate that. I know Becky's already left, and I'll be sending a very, very long email saying thank you to them, but to Eloise and to Chucky, thank you from the bottom of my heart for letting me do this. I loved the fact that we were able to do this at Foundation. Please, to all our listeners today, all the attendees, please do take a look at the Discord chat if you would like to. If any of you would like to follow up with any questions, I'm very quickly dropping my email address into the chat as well. And of course, we did have our feedback form. But all I will say is thank you so much, and have a wonderful, for those in the UK, have a wonderful rest of LGBT History Month. For those who may be tuning in from everywhere else, the whole year is LGBT History Month, why not? So thank you for your wonderful time, and I'm sure we shall speak again soon. That's how I shall end this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethos, for putting this together and inviting us. And yeah, thank you. It was really lovely.
Yes, thank you for the invite. It was so nice to be in part of this discussion.
I'm so glad. Well, thanks. Thanks a ton. Bye, folks.